thank you for having me. Who was Francisco Suarez? Well, he was a Jesuit priest, a member of the Society of Jesus, and he lived from 1548 until 1617. And he taught at some of the great universities in Europe, Collegio Romano, the Roman College in Rome, and then also the University of Salamanca, and also he finished his teaching career at the University of Coimbra in Portugal, which was then under the Spanish crown. But he was a genius. I think he saw himself primarily as a theologian, but his work on metaphysics and philosophy and law have had the most impact. But he was a genius and a very devout man. He was an example of how someone of great personal piety could also be a great thinker, very systematic thinker. I've worked in his Christology and Mariology because I teach theology, but I've also worked on his view of human rights in De Legibus, but also in some of his other writings. So I've also worked on the metaphysics, especially for the proof for the existence of God. And it's rather long, but I think when I studied it, I said, this is extremely convincing. And I was once happy that a professor at the Sorbonne, Pierre Aubanc, I asked him about Suarez's proof for the existence of God in Disputation 28, and he said, I think it's irrefutable. So it's not too often that people are so convinced, but you have to give the time in and think of what he's saying. And behind that is the notion of God being totally independent, but everything created is dependent on God. So that sense of everything contingent and created is dependent on God. It's a very deep insight that's metaphysical, but also very spiritual. I would say the most important in terms of what has been studied would be the metaphysical disputations, the 54 metaphysical disputations, because there were attempts to systematize metaphysics before that, but they would mostly rely upon Aristotle. And Suarez was a genius. He saw problems in Aristotle. And there's metaphysics in St. Thomas, but not a single book. So Suarez really took time off from teaching theology because he saw that his students did not know metaphysics. So at Salamanca, and I think he probably finished the editing in Coimbra, he put out a systematized metaphysics, which is, of course, the philosophy of being, existence, and I would call it a theistic metaphysics, that you have to understand God and creation and the relation of creation to God. So I think that's one of his most important works. On law, De Legibus is also important, but the theological works are also extremely important. I like he was commenting on the third part of the Summa of St. Thomas Aquinas, the Summa Theologiae, but he expanded like a genius. So the one part of De Incarnatione is on the incarnation, and then the next part on the mysteries of Christ's life, De Mysteriis Vitae Christi. That's where he systematizes Mariology, which had never been done before, in 336 pages, 2 columns. So he went and looked at all the privilege, and it made an impact, because Pope Pius XII quotes him twice. When he defined the Assumption, he quotes Suarez in 1950, and when he issued an encyclical on the queenship of Mary, he quotes Suarez there too. So he made a great impact. He wrote a huge book on the angels, De Angelis, and huge books on grace, which is one of the most difficult subjects. You say, well, yes, we believe in God's grace, but how does God's grace work in conjunction with human free will? Yes. And he really worked it out very carefully. Yes, I think his work was in metaphysics had the most immediate impact, because it was studied not only in the Catholic universities of Europe, but also in the Lutheran ones, something noted by St. John Paul II in his 1988 encyclical Fides et Ratio, because it was the most systematic text in metaphysics. There is influence in Descartes. People have studied that. And then also Leibniz, some other great philosophers certainly were influenced by Suarez. And Christian Wolff, who also tried to systematize metaphysics, was very influenced by Suarez. And Heidegger, too, pays tribute to him, though Heidegger's system is very different. So philosophers have all recognized, if they're good philosophers, the importance of Suarez for metaphysics. But his influence on law and human rights, where he's in this Spanish school, or this Iberian school, going back to Francisco de Vitoria, that's beginning to be studied more seriously, because really that out of that school comes international law. And many people have, in the United States, who study law, they've never heard of Francisco Suarez, but I think in Spain and Portugal, people would see that heritage, which is starting, people are starting to wake up and see its importance for human rights, and this idea that the human race forms one community, bonded together by mutual love and also mutual need. And this is what has been stressed in recent years, but it was quite modern in that sense. That yes, we have different languages, different nations and so on, but the human community it's a community because we share the same common human nature. Well, it's a good question. What is the relevance of Francisco Suarez today? I think in understanding God, people have a very sometimes superficial notion of who God is. But Francisco Suarez understood God as really the source of all existence, and that we cannot understand the universe and human beings apart from God. But he thought this could be done through reason, not just faith. And so, though he sometimes makes allusions to Christ in the metaphysical disputations, his argument for the existence of God, for example, is totally based on reason and argumentation. And so I think that he is important to understand God and human freedom. So I think, and human dignity, and the human race as a community, which is very important now with quarrels in countries over immigration and so on. No, he would say there has to be charity towards all. There are laws and limitations, yes. There has to be order, but the human rights are based upon a common human nature and human dignity. That he saw quite well. He wasn't the only one of that time, but he saw it very clearly.